March 17, 1945, Remagen, Germany. A cold fog clung to the steep hills above the Rhine as the first light of dawn broke through the haze. The air smelled of smoke, cordite, and the burnt remains of the little riverside town that had once been peaceful. Below, the mighty Rhine shimmered like molten steel beneath the morning sun, and across it, the battered skeleton of the Ludendorff Bridge stood, groaning like a dying giant. American engineers, mud-smeared and sleepless, worked frantically beneath the wreckage. The massive iron truss bridge, once the key to Germany's western defense, had finally given way after days of constant bombardment, collapsing into the Rhine with a thunderous roar. Plumes of smoke and dust still rose from the riverbanks where it had fallen. Captain John W. Leonard of the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion wiped grime from his goggles, shouting over the roar of generators and the clang of steel. "We need pontoons in the water now. That armor isn't waiting." His voice carried urgency, not panic, but the disciplined edge of men who understood the stakes. Above the engineers, U.S. tanks from the 9th Armored Division sat idling on the western bank, their treads grinding into the mud. The crews leaned out of their turrets, watching impatiently as combat engineers raced to replace the lost crossing. The Ludendorff Bridge had been a miracle when they captured it intact just 10 days earlier. Now its loss threatened to halt the Allied spearhead into the heart of Germany. The Rhine was no ordinary river. It was a natural fortress, wide, deep, and fast-moving, the last great barrier before the heartland of the Reich. For months, Hitler's generals had boasted that no army could cross it under fire. "The Allies will bleed themselves dry at the Rhine," General Alfred Jodl had told his staff. "It will be our salvation." But salvation was slipping away. On the opposite bank, German artillery thundered intermittently, sending shells crashing into the muddy shoreline. Shrapnel hissed through the air as soldiers dove for cover. A platoon of engineers was pinned down near the wreckage, their pontoon rafts half submerged in the current. Sergeant Frank Delaney, a wiry man from Boston, gritted his teeth as a mortar shell exploded nearby. "We'll cross it, sir," he shouted to his captain. "If we have to swim it, we'll cross it." Behind them, the roar of engines signaled reinforcements arriving, columns of trucks and armored vehicles from the First Army rolling in, the men shouting to one another over the chaos. Radios crackled with orders from headquarters. General Courtney Hodges wanted that bridge rebuilt now. Every hour lost gave the Germans time to regroup. And the Germans were regrouping. Across the river, in a commandeered farmhouse overlooking the eastern bank, General Gunther Blumentritt stood beside a map table. His uniform was immaculate, but his face was drawn, eyes red from exhaustion, his hands trembling slightly as he studied the latest reports. "The bridge has fallen," said his aide, Captain Meissner. "Our artillery finally brought it down." Blumentritt didn't answer immediately. He stared out the window, where the distant flashes of American guns lit the horizon. "And yet," he said quietly, "they keep coming. They're already building another." "Impossible, Herr General," Meissner replied, disbelief in his tone. "They cannot erect a crossing in hours. Even our best engineers would need days." Blumentritt turned, his expression grim. "You underestimate them. I've seen what these Americans can do. They don't stop, not for rain, not for night, not for death itself." At that moment, far below the cliffs, a new sound rose above the chaos, the rhythmic pounding of hammers, the grinding of winches, the metallic clang of steel beams. American engineers were laying the foundation for a pontoon bridge, their work illuminated by floodlights and the glow of burning buildings. Each plank laid, each cable tightened, was another defiance of Hitler's promises. By nightfall, the Rhine's black waters were filled with floating sections of pontoon, heavy steel boats lashed together by chains and timbers. Bulldozers rumbled along the bank, clearing debris. Engineers shouted coordinates, their breath steaming in the cold night air. A crane swung overhead, lowering massive girders into place while sparks showered into the river. A reporter from Stars and Stripes later wrote, "It was as if an entire army had turned into bridge builders overnight." But to the men on the ground, there was no poetry in it, only exhaustion, mud, and the constant whistle of incoming shells. A single hit could destroy hours of work. Yet the engineers kept at it, guided by dim red lamps to avoid drawing sniper fire. By midnight, parts of the temporary bridge were already taking shape. The Americans had no intention of waiting days. They would cross within hours, come hell or high water. Meanwhile, on the German side, disbelief spread through the ranks. Reconnaissance units reported strange activity on the western shore, lights, machinery, movement. At first, officers dismissed it as salvage operations. But when dawn approached and the outlines of a new crossing appeared through the mist, the reality became undeniable. Colonel Hans Scheller, a veteran of Stalingrad now commanding a battered regiment near Remagen, stared through his binoculars and muttered, "Mein Gott, they're building another bridge." March 18, 1945, west bank of the Rhine, near Remagen. The morning broke cold and grey, a low mist hugging the river like smoke from an invisible fire. From the western bank came the constant thrum of engines and the sharp clang of steel. The American engineers had worked through the night without pause, no sleep, no rest, just the mechanical rhythm of progress. Lieutenant Colonel H. Milton Seaman, commander of the 254th Engineer Combat Battalion, stood on the bank, binoculars pressed to his face. His men were waist-deep in freezing water, tightening cables and bolting panels into place. "We're almost there," he muttered, his voice hoarse from shouting orders all night. "Just hold it steady." Nearby, combat engineers from the 291st Battalion maneuvered massive pontoon sections into the current, fighting both the river's pole and enemy artillery. The men worked in pairs, using poles to position the floating pontoons while others secured them with heavy iron chains. They moved with practiced coordination, every motion a blend of precision and desperation. Across the water, German gunners watched through the morning fog. From concealed positions on the eastern hills, 88mm flak guns began to fire. Shells screamed overhead, exploding in geysers of mud and spray. The engineers didn't stop. They ducked, flinched, cursed, but kept building. Private Harold Red Kinney from the 9th Armored Division remembered it vividly. Every time a shell hit near the river, the water slapped up so hard it felt like rain. But you couldn't leave your post. You knew the armor was waiting. We had to give them a way across, or none of us were going home. Behind the engineers, the bridgehead swarmed with life. Trucks roared up from the rear lines carrying supplies, steel plates, cables, generators, and rations. Bulldozers churned the mud into makeshift roads. Signal Corps units strung lines for communications. Military police directed traffic through the chaos, waving jeeps and half-tracks into position. The entire operation moved like clockwork under fire. By mid-morning, General William Hogue, commander of Combat Command B, 9th Armored Division, arrived at the site. His jeep pulled to a stop beside the river, tires sinking into the mud. Climbing out, he surveyed the scene, his steel helmet flecked with rain. "Seaman," he called out over the noise, "how long until we can move tanks?" "By this evening, sir," Seaman replied, wiping his face. "If we can keep the Krauts from zeroing us in." Hogue nodded. "Make it happen. The faster we cross, the sooner this war ends." Meanwhile, reconnaissance planes droned overhead, circling the eastern bank. Aerial photographs would later reveal the Germans scrambling to form a new defensive line, but too late. The Americans had seized momentum, and the Rhine, once the pride of Hitler's natural defense, was no longer a barrier. Farther downstream, at Oppenheim and Mainz, other engineer units began preparing their own crossings. The U.S. Third Army under General George S. Patton, never one to be outdone, had already started constructing bridges before higher command even gave the order. "Bradley will read about it in the papers before I tell him," Patton joked in his diary. But at Remagen, the crossing remained the symbol of American audacity. Every hour mattered. As the day wore on, the engineers' efforts bore fruit. Long steel sections connected across the pontoons, forming a narrow but sturdy path. The first test vehicle, a 2.5-ton truck loaded with sandbags, rolled slowly onto the bridge. The pontoons dipped, the chains groaned, but the structure held. A cheer erupted from the riverbank. Lieutenant Seaman grinned for the first time in hours. "Get the Shermans ready," he barked. And so they came. From the muddy staging ground behind the bridge, the first M4 Sherman tank rumbled forward, its tread squealing as it climbed onto the pontoon bridge. The men on the riverbank stopped to watch, holding their breath. The bridge swayed under the massive weight, water sloshing up through the seams, but still it held. Slowly, deliberately, the tank rolled forward, crossing the Rhine. When it reached the far side, its crew waved triumphantly through the turret hatch. It was a moment of pure defiance, a symbol that Hitler's river fortress had been breached again, this time by American ingenuity and sheer willpower. By nightfall, entire armored columns began to move. The pontoon bridge glowed under the dim red light of covered lamps, tanks and trucks rumbling across like a metallic river of their own. Infantry followed on foot, rifles slung over their shoulders, faces blackened with mud and soot. From the eastern bank, the thunder of artillery grew weaker. The German gunners were running low on ammunition. Many of their guns had already been knocked out by Allied airstrikes earlier that day. General Blumentritt received the latest reports in his headquarters near Linz. His aide burst into the room, face pale. "Herr General, they've crossed. At least 2 armored divisions are moving east of the river." Blumentritt stared at him, unable to speak for a moment. "2 divisions?" "Yes, sir. And more on the way. They built a bridge in less than 12 hours. He sank into his chair, his shoulders heavy. "It's over," he whispered. "The Rhine was our shield, and they walked right across it." For the German command, the realization hit like a hammer. For years, they had trusted in the Rhine as an impenetrable line, a symbol of national pride and divine protection. Yet now, in less than a day, it had been crossed by the very army they'd sworn to stop. That night, the sounds of victory echoed along the river, the steady rumble of engines, the shouts of soldiers, and the creak of a bridge that defied the impossible. March 19, 1945, East Bank of the Rhine, Germany. The fog lifted slowly that morning, revealing a scene that no German soldier had thought possible. Across the Rhine, the horizon shimmered with the glint of sunlight off endless steel, columns of American armor, artillery, and trucks, streaming across the pontoon bridge in an unbroken line. For the German defenders along the East Bank, it was a sight that carried both awe and despair. They had expected at least a week before the Americans could build a crossing large enough to handle tanks. Instead, they watched helplessly as entire divisions flowed into what had once been the heart of Hitler's fortress Europe. At an observation post near Erpel, a German lieutenant named Karl-Heinz Loh peered through his binoculars and felt his stomach tighten. "They're not stopping," he said to the sergeant beside him. "They're crossing faster than we can shoot." The sergeant, a veteran of the Eastern Front, spat into the dirt. "We saw this before," he muttered bitterly. "At the Dnieper, at the Vistula, once the enemy finds the river crossing, the war is lost." And this time, it was Germany's turn to face that fate. Farther back, in a bomb-scarred command bunker near Bad Honnef, General Gustav von Zungen, commander of Army Group B, stood before a large wall map, his face ghostly under the dim light. Red arrows marked Allied advances along the Rhine. Each hour, the front lines shifted farther east. His staff officers crowded around, whispering grimly as fresh reports arrived. One major read from a telegram, his voice trembling. "American engineers have established a heavy pontoon bridge at Remagen. Traffic includes medium armor, trucks, and infantry. Estimated crossing strength, 2 divisions by morning." Von Zungen slammed his fist against the table. 2 divisions. In 10 hours. His voice broke, half anger, half disbelief. Do you understand what this means? They've broken the last line before the Ruhr. Colonel Meissner, who had been at Blumentritt's headquarters the day before, spoke softly. We believed they'd need weeks. Hitler himself said the Rhine would stop them. Now, he hesitated, searching for words. Now it's as if the river doesn't exist. Von Zangen turned away, staring at the concrete wall. Tell me, Colonel. How do we explain to the Führer that his miracle line has failed? No one answered. Meanwhile, on the American side, the atmosphere could not have been more different. At the bridgehead, General William Hogue stood beside General Courtney Hodges of the U.S. First Army. The two men surveyed the massive operation taking shape before them. Bulldozers carved new roads into the far bank while tanks formed defensive perimeters. Engineers, blackened with soot and sweat, worked to widen and reinforce the bridge. Hodges lit a cigarette, his face expressionless as he watched yet another Sherman roll across the pontoon. You've done it, Bill, he said quietly. We've cracked Germany open. Hogue exhaled slowly, nodding. It won't be long now. Once Patton gets across downstream, they'll have nowhere left to run. That prediction proved deadly accurate. Downriver, General George S. Patton was already pushing his engineers to outdo Remagen. At Oppenheim, his men built 2 bridges in just 48 hours, one for vehicles, another for infantry. Patton himself drove his jeep across before the structure was even officially completed, shouting to his staff, "Don't tell anyone I beat them to it, I want to see Bradley's face first." But beyond the humor, Patton knew the truth: the crossing at Remagen had shattered German morale. The myth of the Rhine's invincibility was dead. Back on the German side, panic rippled through the ranks. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, newly appointed to command the Western Front, received frantic radio messages from subordinates all along the river. Some units reported total collapse, others simply stopped responding. At his field headquarters near Düsseldorf, Kesselring pored over a map covered in pins and notes. His operations officer, Major General Adolf Husinger, pointed to the expanding bridgehead at Remagen. They've already moved artillery across, sir. If they widen this salient, the Ruhr will be encircled. Kesselring's jaw tightened. Order immediate counterattacks. Use what we have left, tanks, flak, Volkssturm, whatever standing. Husinger hesitated. With respect, Herr Feldmarschall, we have nothing left that can stop them. The old field marshal's eyes flashed. Then we'll make them bleed for every meter. That afternoon, the Germans launched a desperate counteroffensive. Remnants of the 11th Panzer Division and hastily assembled infantry units attacked from the east, supported by Nebelwerfer rocket batteries. The sky filled with streaks of fire as shells crashed into the bridgehead. American anti-aircraft guns returned fire, while P-47 Thunderbolts swooped low overhead, strafing German positions. The battle raged for hours, smoke and dust obscuring the river. Several sections of the pontoon bridge were damaged, but the engineers repaired them almost immediately, working under fire, welding and hammering as shells fell around them. Private Kinney, the same young engineer who had survived the previous night, recalled later. You could see the bridge shaking under the blasts, water spraying up like rain. But those guys never stopped. They patched holes, tightened cables, dragged wounded men aside, and then kept going. I'd never seen anything like it. By sunset, the counterattack had failed. The Americans had not only held the bridge but expanded their foothold across the Rhine. German prisoners began to trickle in, exhausted, disoriented, many of them barely more than teenagers. They spoke of orders that made no sense, of commanders who had vanished, of hope that had died long before the bridge did. That night, in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Adolf Hitler received word of the crossing. For several minutes, he said nothing. His face went pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he read the report. Then, in a sudden explosion of fury, he turned on his generals. Traitors! Incompetents, he shouted, his voice echoing through the corridor. You let them cross the Rhine. You promised me it would hold for months, and you lost it in a single day. No one dared speak. Only the ticking of the map room clock broke the silence. Hitler slammed his fist on the table. Destroy that bridge. If it still stands tomorrow, every officer responsible will be executed. His rage meant nothing now. The Allies had crossed. Germany's last natural defense was gone. The end was only weeks away. On the river, the night was strangely quiet. The firing had stopped. The bridge gleamed under dim red lights, a symbol of both destruction and creation. As Sergeant Delaney stood watch on the eastern bank, he looked across at the dark water and whispered, "The Rhine. We made it." Behind him, the thunder of tanks rolled eastward, toward the Ruhr, toward Cologne, toward victory. The impossible had been done. In less than 10 hours, the Allies had built a bridge across the Rhine, and with it, they had crossed the threshold into the heart of Nazi Germany. March 21, 1945, east bank of the Rhine, near Remagen. The sun rose blood-orange over the river, its reflection rippling across the water like fire. The once proud German Rhine line, a defensive dream that had survived in Hitler's speeches and propaganda reels for years, was now a scar of smoke, twisted iron, and crumbling stone. The thunder of artillery had faded into a low, constant hum in the distance, drowned by the mechanical chorus of trucks, tanks, and bulldozers. The Allies had done what no army in history had achieved under such conditions, crossed the Rhine under fire and secured a continuous bridgehead. What began as a desperate engineering gamble had turned into one of the most astonishing logistical triumphs of the war. By now, the temporary pontoon bridge at Remagen was joined by two more, Bailey bridges constructed by the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion and the 299th Engineer Combat Battalion. Each could support the weight of a Sherman tank or even a fully loaded M26 Pershing, the new American heavy armor being ferried in to punch deeper into Germany. Every hour, hundreds of vehicles crossed eastward. Convoys stretched back for miles along the western bank, fuel trucks, half-tracks, jeeps, ambulances, and endless streams of soldiers marching in mud-splattered uniforms. The Rhine, once Germany's last hope, now carried the sounds of its own defeat. The German side, the illusion shattered. In a command post outside Bonn, Field Marshal Walter Model, known as Hitler's fireman for his desperate defensive maneuvers, stood over a map littered with markers. His expression was hollow, eyes sunken with exhaustion. Reports from his corps commanders were increasingly dire. The 15th Army was shattered. The 5th Panzer Army was barely functional. Entire divisions existed on paper only. Fuel reserves were gone, ammunition scarce. The once mighty Wehrmacht had become a patchwork of exhausted veterans, wounded survivors, and terrified teenage conscripts from the Volkssturm. A junior officer entered the bunker, saluting stiffly. Herr Feldmarschall, the Americans have established permanent supply lines across the bridge at Remagen. They're bringing artillery across now. Model nodded slowly, his hand trembling as he reached for a cigarette. Then that's it, he said softly. The Rhine is no longer a barrier. It's a road. The officer hesitated. What shall we tell Berlin? Model looked up, his face illuminated by the flickering oil lamp. Tell them what they want to hear. Tell them we're counterattacking. He gave a bitter smile. And then pray the Americans get here first. The Allies expand the bridgehead. On the eastern shore, U.S. forces dug in deeper. The 9th Armored Division established strongpoints along the rolling hills leading toward Linz and Westerburg. Infantry from the 47th Regiment fanned out into the countryside, clearing villages house by house. Captain John Leonard, the same engineer who had shouted orders on the riverbank days before, now oversaw the maintenance of the pontoon bridges. Standing beside a crew tightening anchor chains, he marveled at what his men had accomplished. 10 hours, he muttered. We did it in 10 damn hours. Nearby, Major General Hogue observed through binoculars as artillery units moved eastward. "We're rolling faster than they can fall back," he told his aide. "Keep the pressure on. Every bridge we build shortens this war." Air cover from the 9th Air Force patrolled constantly overhead, strafing retreating German columns and hammering any concentration of enemy armor. The once formidable Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen, its remaining aircraft grounded by fuel shortages or destroyed on the tarmac. The sky belonged to the Allies now. The German counterblow. Despite their despair, the Germans were not finished yet. On March 22, Hitler ordered the newly formed Sonderkommando Elbe, a suicide air unit, to attack the bridges at Remagen. From hidden airfields, a handful of Me-262 jet fighters and FW-190s roared into the sky, their pilots desperate to destroy what their ground forces could not. Anti-aircraft batteries on the western bank opened up immediately, filling the sky with black bursts of flak. The air trembled with explosions and tracer fire. Captain Leonard ducked behind a sandbag wall as one Me-262 streaked low over the bridge, releasing its bombs. The blast shook the riverbank, sending a column of water and debris into the air, but when the smoke cleared, the bridge still stood. The pilots never returned. Later that day, German V-2 rockets were launched toward the site from hidden launch pads near the Ruhr. Several fell miles short, one detonated near a supply convoy, killing dozens of soldiers and engineers. But the bridge itself remained untouched. General Hodges, upon hearing of the attacks, simply remarked, "They can bomb it all they want. We've got 3 more waiting." Inside Hitler's bunker. In Berlin, the Führer's rage reached a fever pitch. The reports from Remagen were read aloud in the dimly lit war room beneath the chancellery. Hitler's face turned crimson. "This is treason," he shouted, striking the table so hard that maps fluttered to the floor. "Destroy the bridge, or destroy yourselves." His engineers explained that the Luftwaffe could no longer mount sustained attacks. Ammunition shortages, fuel scarcity, and Allied air superiority had rendered them helpless. Hitler dismissed the explanations with a snarl. If our soldiers were true Germans, they would swim across and blow it up with their bare hands. But even in his fury, the reality was undeniable. His generals no longer believed victory was possible. The Rhine, his shield of the Reich, was gone. March 24, the Allied avalanche. By the 24th, the Remagen bridgehead had swollen to encompass over 25,000 American troops. Artillery units deployed on both sides of the river, providing a continuous curtain of fire to cover advancing infantry. Supply trucks brought forward rations, ammunition, and fuel at a pace that stunned even the planners. The Germans could no longer tell where the front line ended. At dawn, waves of American tanks advanced eastward. The thunder of their guns rolled across the countryside as towns fell one after another. By evening, they had reached Altenkirchen, 20 miles beyond the Rhine. The push toward the Ruhr industrial basin had begun. For the German people, the once unthinkable had become a daily reality, Allied tanks rolling through their streets, columns of prisoners marching west, the black smoke of burning fuel depots rising on the horizon. Epilogue: the river of no return. The Remagen crossing would later be remembered as more than just a battle, it was a symbol. It marked the moment when the Nazi regime's illusion of invincibility finally shattered. In just 10 hours, a handful of American engineers and soldiers had accomplished what German generals considered impossible. They had turned a river meant to divide nations into a bridge that united armies. Captain Leonard wrote in his field journal that night. "The Rhine was supposed to stop us. Instead, it carried us forward. Every plank we laid, every cable we tightened, felt like driving another nail into the coffin of this war." By early April, the Allies had encircled the Ruhr, capturing hundreds of thousands of German troops. The bridge at Remagen eventually collapsed under its own stress, killing several engineers, but by then, it no longer mattered. The war had already moved beyond the Rhine. And in the hearts of the men who crossed it, one truth remained clear. No wall, no line, no river, not even the Rhine, could stop the tide of freedom once it began to rise.